especially delighted to share with you some insights on the life of Joan of Arc. Most of you know I was a little boy in France, and she was one of the great heroes that appeared before us, starting in first grade, and remained very present through our lives. And I understand in the Orthodox world she's less well known. So this is a great opportunity to encounter an extraordinary manifestation of God's action in our lives, of God's grace, and of a human heart deeply in love with our Lord. So, we will begin now with the story of a young lady whose name is not Joan but Jeanne, Jeanne d'Arc. Let me hear you all say the French version. Jeanne d'Arc. One more time. Jeanne d'Arc. That's right, Jeanne, not Joan.
I said Jeanne.
You did? Jeanne. She was an illiterate. That means she didn't go to school. She didn't know how to read or write. A peasant girl from a little town in France, 90 years into the 100 Years' War. For 100 years, France and England had been fighting, and one of the reasons they were fighting, or the main reason really, was what William the Conqueror had done. Remember William the Conqueror from last week? See, the Normans had gone to England, and lands belonged back and forth to both the Normans in England, the Normans in France, and there was a lot of argument about who owned the land. So for nearly 100 years, 90 years, that's a long time for burning and pillaging and killing. But let me tell you, there were prophecies going down through time, prophecies that one day France would be saved by a maiden. And the first to give that prophecy was none other than Merlin from the days of King Arthur. Speaking of a young maiden who would appear from Le Bois Chenu, the ancient woods, the ancient lands, and save her country. So all the way down to her being born, there was this expectation that something wonderful was going to appear. So, there's Jeanne d'Arc tending her sheep. When she turned 13, we have any 13-year-olds here? Close to it, right? We have a 13-year-old right over there. Right? You raised your hand. 13 years old. We got some 10-year-olds, right? So just a couple years older than you, she started hearing voices. Now, in today's world, that sounds a little strange, but not in her world. Here's what she said, her very words. One of the amazing things is that we have a tremendous record of her life and what she said. This is the voice of Jeanne d'Arc. The voices came from the right, from the direction of the church, and was accompanied by a bright light. Sometimes the ringing of church bells would trigger them. So she's giving us a description of this mystery. At first it was Saint Michael. You know Saint Michael, the archangel? The archangel, Saint Michael, appeared. And he appeared to her and said that she would be visited by these other angels, these saints who had lived before, and that she was to listen to what they said to her, to trust that it was God's will for her life, what they were bringing to her. And so we have these artistic depiction of this mystery, and I'm going to show you various versions of it, because it's unimaginable really how this happens, except that it really happened for her. She would say that when those voices would appear, she would be filled with joy. Filled with joy. And then when they left, she'd be sad that these beautiful beings of light were gone. And at first, they would tell her to be a good daughter, to go to church. And then as time went on, because this went on for the next couple of years, they started telling her new things. Like, you need to go see the Dauphin, the man who would be king of France, who wasn't crowned king because the English wanted the throne. So he was sort of hoping that someday he might be king, but he didn't have the strength to make it happen. And so these voices told this peasant girl to find a way to go to the king, to tell him what he needed to do in order for him to be crowned king. Basically, to become the leader of his soldiers to win the war against the English. Now imagine that. A 13-year-old girl, 14, 15, she knows nothing about military things, nothing about politics, nothing about anything like that. But she's being told, you are going to go do that. And we've got her writing saying that she would have rather stayed home, remained spinning, sewing at my mother's side. Yet must I go, and must I do this thing, for my Lord wills that I do so. So she didn't want to do this, but she was compelled, she was pressed forward by these beautiful visitations. So what do you do in such a case? How do you go from being just a little girl in the countryside to finding the king and talking to him and convincing him? So the voices told her she had to cut her hair like a boy's. She had beautiful long hair. She had to cut it so that she could travel, because in those days, with war going on and still barbarians out there, thieves and such, it was very dangerous to travel for everybody, but especially for a woman. So she had to disguise herself as a boy. And so she went to the local military commander of the area, telling her she had to go see the king. So first she had to convince this captain, with his big swords and all of that, to take her to see the king. And of course he wouldn't believe her. So she says to him, and we have this also, she says that she's the only one who can help, and only she can bring the king to victory and to coronation. And at that moment, this is recorded by the captain, the wind changed direction, and he was able to sail with his soldiers where they needed to go. So he witnessed this strange miracle right after this young peasant girl talked to him, and that was enough to say, okay, there's something going on here. So he accompanies her to see the king, because that experience with these angelic presences made her supremely confident and sure of herself, to the point where even the tough old soldiers would believe her. Here's a lovely painting of Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. She's actually painted older than she was. She was 16 by the time she was ready to go see the king. But you can see that look in her eyes, that distant look. And if you look very carefully to her left, look up in the trees. What do you see? Up in the leaves. What do you see?
An angel.
You see an angel. You all see the angel in the trees there, that face peering out. I saw this painting in New York, and it's about as large as the entire back wall. So you can really see the power of that painting. To me, it's one of the very special ones. So before, yes?
Who painted the...
I'll have to get back to you.
Okay.
Nobody particularly known. Yes?
What year was she born?
The conclusion of her life was 1431.
1431.
So it would be 1420, you tell me. 16 minus 1431.
15.
No, actually, she was 19 by the time that year came around. 1412 or so, yeah.
So she died when she was 19.
No, I haven't said that yet. We don't know that yet, okay? Let's keep it a surprise for everybody. They didn't hear that, okay? What I want to do next as we proceed with this amazing story is I want to give you a feel for it, thanks to Hollywood. This is just an impression of the Joan of Arc story. But sometimes, as you know, images speak louder than words. So I want to include this in our experience and give you a sense of this extraordinary story. So that's a quick flavor of her life, her journey. of this young woman who had nothing and didn't seem to have anything to offer, and no power in the world, and the impact she had on it. It's always good to see how movies try to present it. You know, they have such a thing as artistic license. Anybody know what that means, artistic license? Kids, you ever heard that word, those words together before? Artistic license, that means we're going to make it up a little bit to, in the name of art, to give it a feeling, to express it in some other way. It's not necessarily exactly right. So, remember that picture of the sword falling in the field? That didn't happen in her visions, but some movie director decided we're going to try it this way because we think it should have happened because it's supernatural looking. As though her story wasn't fascinating enough. You did see the bells, right? Remember seeing the bells? And you heard me read her words. Sometimes hearing the bells at the church would stimulate the voices. It would help the angels come to her. So that was accurate. But other things weren't quite the case. So you always want to be careful in the movies. Don't take for granted that that's the actual story. Like this painting right here. So here's a painting of Joan of Arc who goes to see the king. Can anybody tell me what's wrong with this painting?
It doesn't show the king.
Huh? Yeah, that's see, the king hasn't been crowned yet, so he doesn't really look like a king. That's him in the green outfit right there. What's wrong with that picture is that she's in armor already.
And
When
there's
she-
this thing around her head.
Well, that's, you know what that is? That's the light that is present for saints. Yes.
That is what I was going to say.
Oh, you knew that. Good for you. That's exactly what it is. But she was still a peasant girl. She had to first convince the king. So the Joan of Arc that we know with the armor didn't exist yet. So this was a little closer to the idea of what was happening, although even that is not a true picture. That's a little closer. How about that one? An old French history book picture. So here's the story. She goes to the king's castle, and his advisors are very concerned about this. They don't want him to get caught up in anything that could be trouble for him. He was this nobody showing up, who's not supposed to be showing up like that. They don't do that in those days. And he's going to talk about hearing supernatural voices and such. That could be very dangerous for the king, for his reputation. His enemies could use it against him. The English who are in France wanting to take over the country. So he decides to disguise himself as somebody in the court. All right? He doesn't look like a king. He's mixed in with the crowd, just to see what happens. And 16-year-old Joan shows up from the country into the castle and immediately recognizes him. So already he can tell there's something there, there's a gift. She recognizes him. When she, they didn't have newspapers back then. There was no way to have seen a picture of him. She knows who he is. And then they have a private meeting. He was willing to give a private meeting. That's how badly he wanted to be king, and he couldn't figure out how to manage it because he was weak, and the English had been winning for so long. And they come out of that private meeting with him giving her his soldiers, a coat of armor, and letting her lead the way. So what happened in that meeting? Something made him certain that she was sent from God. Do you know what happened in that meeting? Is that why you're raising your hand?
She was telling about the voices that she heard, and then that inspired him a little bit.
That's a good point. Did you all hear that? She told him about the voices and it inspired him. One would hope that would work, but people tend to be very suspicious, very cynical. They won't believe it if they can't see it and so forth. In this case, she told him about a prayer that he had made, a solemn prayer he had made to God, if ever he were to be king. A deeply personal, intimate moment of his life that she knew about. And that did the trick. That was what he needed to know. And so from that point, she became the Joan of Arc that we know, this peasant girl. Again, we have a painting that's not quite right. She didn't have the long hair, remember? She cut it short like a boy's to disguise herself. But the artist wanted to remind us that this was a young woman, 16 years old. So she, one more wonderful story about her sword. You know, we've talked about in other gatherings about magic swords and such like that. Remember the sword of Roland?
Yeah.
And she also had a very special sword. The voices revealed to her that there was a sword, an old sword, behind an altar at one of the churches nearby. So the men went to find it, and there was this old rusty sword. And they shook it, and the rust came right off. And that was the sword for her. But here's the best part. You know, we see her in her statues and paintings with her sword and a beautiful white horse. She never killed anybody. She said so. She never used the sword to kill anybody. She's in the middle of the wars. She's right up in the front, but she's always holding that standard, that banner, that white banner. She never pulled out her sword and used it. Although in the movies you might see that because they want to add some action. But she did not kill anybody. And what's amazing about her, I show you this sort of simple cartoon drawing because that's what she was doing all the time. Telling the soldiers to go forward. And for years after that, during the rest of this 100 Years' War, they used her method, which was what they called frontal assault. Just charge forward boldly. That was her message to King Charles. Be bold, charge forward. And when the soldiers saw her, a great roar went up from all the soldiers because she made them enthusiastic and courageous and hopeful. This one young woman, she rallied them emotionally and spiritually. And her first great victory was at Orléans, where there was a siege around the city from the English. She broke it in 9 days. She was wounded. And while they were trying to remove her from the battlefield, she didn't want to leave, even though she had an arrow stuck in her shoulder. She kept telling them, charge. So imagine this 16-year-old peasant girl being pulled away with an arrow in her, yelling at the soldiers, keep going, charge, fight forward, you know. And all of them were inspired, like you said, by her. And they won. And having won that great victory for the first time in years over the English, this is the picture of what happened. The king was crowned, the Dauphin was crowned King of France, claimed his reign, which was for her the purpose of her mission, was to give France its rightful king. And they say that she wept many tears in that very magnificent moment when she accomplished her mission. But of course it wasn't over because the English were still in France. There was still lots of fighting to be done. And this is where our story starts changing a little. So we go from the peasant girl who hears these divine voices, who's inspired to go find the king. She leads his soldiers into victory. He's crowned, and then guess what? He stops. You have an idea?
There's no more voice. The voices are gone.
No, I thank heavens that's not what happens. The voices do stay with her. But it's the king who's gone. He's no longer... Oh, is that what you were going to say?
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
The king died.
He doesn't die. He doesn't support her anymore. So this young woman who made him king against all odds, he no longer wants to help. Because he's got what he wanted. So he lets her go off with a few soldiers and fight one battle after another. He doesn't give her extra soldiers, extra supplies, any support. So she's out there all by herself, trying to finish the war and save it for France, and nobody's helping her. How about that? How ungrateful can you be? She makes him king, single-handedly almost, and he abandons her and doesn't care what happens to her. And she has predicted, in these strange ways that she had of knowing things, she predicted that she was going to be betrayed and that she was going to be captured. Captured by the English and by treacherous Frenchmen who were working for the English. They knew this was going to happen, and it terrified her because, you know, even with all that armor and inspiration and the divine voices of the angels, and you know those voices, they weren't just any voices. There was two saints who actually lived. There was Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine. Anybody know anything about Saint Catherine? Tomorrow's her name's day. Did you know that? Saint Catherine. This icon that we love and see all the time of Christ there is at the monastery of Saint Catherine, her monastery. And this amazing lady from the Roman days was a brilliant philosopher. And when she became Christian, the emperor sent 50 philosophers to debate with her. And she won. She put them all to shame. Imagine that. And I think it's interesting that that's the voice who talked to Joan, who later had to do something like that. She had to fight off other men who tried to trick her with words and such, just like St. Catherine. And the other one was St. Margaret, who had become a Christian in the Roman days, and they tried to burn her at the stake. And it didn't work. They couldn't make it work. So she too was a presence sort of foretelling what Joan would have to face. So we have this beautiful heroic story of this young lady who leads men into combat and is victorious and saves her country, and yet is betrayed. Where have we heard about betrayal of good people before? What does that sound like? Yes.
When Christ was about to die.
When Christ was about to die. That's right. There's a similarity in this story. This was all for good. This was doing God's will, and yet the people around her decided to betray her, and all kinds of evil things began to happen. And one of the reasons the evil things began to happen was because all the English who wanted France and all the Frenchmen who wanted to work for the English, collaborators, realized that if they could say to the world that Joan of Arc was a sorceress instead of a wonderful Christian, then they could make the king look like he didn't deserve to be king. You see? Politics. So for their desire for running the country, they could get rid of Joan and destroy the king. So these forces turned against her, even though she inspired the whole country, and they won battles they had never won before, and she led men without ever shedding blood into reconquering their lands. So much so that right down to this day, she's still an inspiration to soldiers and to the country of France. That would be the Strasbourg statue that you saw. It's amazing how many little Catholic girls I've run into who were deeply affected by Joan of Arc. She's a great saint to them and deeply touched their hearts. So what we're going to find out here is how it is that someone who did so much for other people, for her country, was so self-sacrificial, was completely betrayed. And sure enough, one day she's out with the soldiers outnumbered, and they leave the fortress walls, right? Have you seen how those castles have big bridges that go down and back up? Do you know what I'm talking about? You know, they put down the, what's that?
A drawbridge?
A drawbridge, exactly. Put down the bridge so you can come out from the fortress and then go back in. So she had gone out with some of her men, and the drawbridge went up and left her stuck outside the walls. And she was swarmed around by the enemy, and they told her to surrender, and she said no, she would not surrender. But there were so many of them, they surrounded her and pulled her off her horse, and Joan of Arc was made prisoner, was captured by the Burgundians, who were fellow Frenchmen, but didn't want that king to rule them. And so they sold her to the English, to the enemy. They sold her to the enemy. And she went on trial, a trial for witchcraft and sorcery and all kinds of lies that they made up. And what amazes everyone is that this, once again, illiterate peasant girl could argue with all these theologians, these men of the church, these well-educated people who were trying to trick her and trap her, and she was able to counter them with her bright mind and her courage to such an extent that these public trials that were done in front of everybody had to be made private because she was embarrassing them by showing them up as fools. So things got very sad for this young lady. She's 19 years old by now. They've got her chained in a tower. The English have her chained. And she's not being cared for by nuns like she should be in this kind of trial. English soldiers stay in her jail cell with her and make fun of her and are rough with her and make life as difficult as possible. And yet she is willing and able to stand there month after month and deal with these accusations and talk back to the judges. In fact, to one of the judges, she says to him, "You say that you are my judge. I do not know. If you are, but take good heed not to judge me ill, because you would put yourself in great peril. And I warn you, so that if God punish you for it, I shall have done my duty in telling you." So even to the man who wants to really get her, she is kind and thoughtful. So I want to tell you something about the man who was out to get her. His name has gone down through history. He was a bishop, a French bishop. This is his name, Cochon. And he had been kicked out of his, what do you call it, where the bishop is bishop. Bishop Fouric, was it? His diocese. He'd been kicked out of his diocese, so he's a Frenchman on the side of the English. And he wanted to be made bishop of a place called Rouen, which was the one town in France that was run by the English. So he was completely treacherous. He was going to get her no matter what. Even if she was completely innocent, he was going to trick her into being guilty so he could satisfy his English masters. And the reason I'm writing this on the board for you is that every French child knows that there's another word that's almost like this. Bishop Cochon and the word cochon. And a few of you must know what this means. Cochon means pig. So down through history, this is how we spell it. This is how we think of this man. He was such a pig in his evil ways with Joan of Arc. And as you're going to hear in a minute, his ways knew no bounds. He sent a fake confessor to her in the prison to try to get information out of her. He told the soldiers to try to molest her, just to make her life miserable. And what we're going to have here in just a few minutes is, I have the very words of the trial that she said, that he said. And I've printed them out because it's so amazing that in 1431 we have the actual words. And to bring it to life, I'm going to have two of you come up and read those words. So, no, wait a minute, no, I need a really evil judge. Where's Randy when you need him? What gentleman is what? No, we need a man to play the evil judge to read this material. No, not that Randy. Randy's, he doesn't. He's probably not good as the evil judge. Unless you have.
Why not William?
You don't know about that?
Hey, why not William? No.
I want to get an older person, so that Randy, are you into acting?
You.
Sure.
All right, we got an evil judge.
Oh, wait, that's Anthony, though.
Evil!
Cochon, that's right. Je m'appelle Cochon. And now we're going to need Joan of Arc. And I'm going to call on somebody who can portray the personality. And some of these words are a little complicated, so I'm going to get Anya. You want to come forward? We need the sort of the rebel type.
We need a feminist up there.
So if you would both stand right over here, and I'm going to hand you the microphone, just pass it back and forth. And take your time reading it, but there's some words in there that are really special. And just go for it. Okay? Let us have the experience of what happened to the young girl.
At what age were you when you first did hear these voices?
I was 13 when I had a voice from God for my help and guidance. The first time that I heard this voice, I was very much frightened. It was midday, in the summer, in my father's garden. I heard this voice to my right, towards the church. Rarely do I hear it without its being accompanied also by a light. This light comes from the same side as the voice. Generally, it is a green light.
How long is it since you heard your voices?
I heard them yesterday and today.
What were you doing yesterday morning when the voice came to you?
I was asleep. The voice awoke me.
Was it by touching you on the arm?
It awoke me without touching me.
Was it in your room?
Not so far as I know, but in the castle.
Did you thank it? Did you go on your knees?
I did thank it. I was sitting in the bed. I joined my hands. I implored its help. The voice said to me, "Answer boldly. God will help thee." Then addressing the Bishop of Beauvais, "You say you are my judge. Take care of what you are doing, for in truth I am sent by God, and you place yourself in great danger."
Has this voice sometimes varied its counsel?
I have never found it give two contrary opinions.
This voice that speaks to you, is it that of an angel, or of a saint, or from God direct?
It is the voice of Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret. Their faces are adorned with beautiful crowns, very rich and precious.
How do you know if these were the two saints? How do you distinguish one from the other?
I know quite well it is they, and I can easily distinguish one from the other.
How do you distinguish them?
By the greeting they give me. It is 7 years now since they have undertaken to guide me. I know them well because they were named to me.
What was the first voice that came to you when you were about 13?
It was Saint Michael. I saw him before my eyes. He was not alone, but quite surrounded by the angels of heaven.
Did you see St. Michael and these angels bodily and in reality?
I saw them with my bodily eyes, as well as I see you. When they went from me, I wept. I should have liked to be taken away with them.
What sign did you give to your king that you came from God?
The sign was that an angel assured my king, in bringing him the crown, that he should have the whole realm of France by the means of God's help and my labors, that he was to set me to work, that is to say, to give me soldiers, and that otherwise he would not be so soon crowned and consecrated.
Of what material was the said crown?
It is well to know it was of fine gold. It was so rich that I do not know how to count its riches or to appreciate its beauty. The crown signified that my king should possess the kingdom of France.
Were there stones in it?
I have told you what I know about it.
Did you touch or kiss it?
No,
Did the angel who brought it come from above or along the ground?
he came from above. I mean, he came at our Lord's bidding. He entered by the door of the chamber.
Did he move along the ground from the door of the chamber?
When he came into the king's presence, he did him reverence, bowing before him and speaking the words I have told you about the sign. Then he reminded him of the beautiful patience he had shown in the face of the great tribulations which had come to him. And from the door of the chamber he stepped and moved along the ground as he came to the king. When the angel came, I accompanied him and went with him up the steps to the king's chamber, and the angel went in first. And then I said to the king, Sire, there is your sign, take it.
Do you know if you are in the grace of God?
If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God so keep me. I should be the saddest in all the world if I knew that I were not in the grace of God. But if I were in a state of sin, do you think the voice would come to me? I would that everyone could hear the voice that I hear it. He came for a great purpose. I was in hopes that the king would believe the sign, and that they would cease to argue with me, and would aid the good people of Orleans. The angel came for the merits of the king and of the good Duke of Orleans.
Why to you rather than to another?
It has pleased God so to do by a simple maiden, in order to drive back the enemies of the king.
If the church militant tells you that your revelations are illusions or diabolical things, will you defer to the church?
I will defer to God, whose commandment I always do. In case the church should prescribe the contrary, I should not refer to anyone in the world, but to God alone, whose commandment I always follow.
Do you not then believe you are subject to the church of God which is on earth, that is to say, our Lord the Pope, to the cardinals, the archbishops, bishops, and other prelates of the church?
Yes, I believe myself to be subject to them, but God must be served first.
Have you then command from your voices not to submit yourself to the church militant which is on earth, not to its decision?
I answer nothing from my own head. What I answer is by command of my voices. They do not order me to disobey the church, but God must be served first.
Very much. Isn't that amazing to have the actual words of that encounter? I want to go back to a particular passage because this was a classic moment when he asks her, do you know if you are in the grace of God? And that is a trick question because the dogma of the church was that we cannot know if we are in the grace of God. So if she says yes, she's going against the dogma of the church and can be declared deviant, heretic, sorceress. Or if she says, no, I'm not in the grace of God, then we have the same problem. She's working for demons. So that yes or that no, either way they had her. And she got out of it by saying, if I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God so keep me. That is some subtle and brilliant thinking for the young lady, isn't it? To parry, like with a sword, that kind of theological trick. And one of the arguments from the judge was only theologians, i.e. males, can decide for you if those voices are from God. You can't decide that for yourself. Think about that. She has this overwhelming experience. And you heard earlier, she says she didn't want to do this. She'd much rather leave with the angels and go live in that heavenly peace. But instead, she has to do what the bidding of the Lord is and go out into battle and deal with betrayal and all that follows instead of the joy and peace that could have been hers. And nevertheless, even that is rejected because she can't know as a simple girl if it's from God or not. So in order to give you one more bit of flavor of the injustice of what happens to this young woman, there's no rational, no reason for this. She saves her country, she gets the king crowned, and then they destroy her. Slowly and surely. They keep, they make everything as difficult as possible for her until they break her, even though the only thing they hadn't counted on was what you just heard in that dialogue, that she had that heroic way of responding to them that kept them unable to condemn her. So I'm going to play you a very short thing. Kids, I want you to watch this. This is a 1928 movie, a silent movie. The reason I'm going to share it with you is that it expresses at a deep level something of what that trial was like, what she was going through, and it will give you a feeling that words can't express. So what that gives you is a feeling for how alone she was, how assaulted she was, how sad she was, and it got so bad that the judge, Cochon, took her to a cemetery in chains, told her that she was going to die by being burned at the stake, and that so terrified her that she finally recanted. That is, okay, I don't believe in my voices, the church is right, you're right, I give up. And so she said, but if I do that, will you let me have communion? Will you let me go to church again? It's been a year now that she's been in prison. And so he tells her that in order to accept her recanting, her turning against her voices, she has to stop wearing men's clothing, she has to wear a dress, and she has to do what they tell her, and she'll spend the rest of her life in jail. And then this is where it becomes really terrible. You see, the English wanted her dead, right? So they didn't like the idea of her spending the rest of her life in jail. So Cochon here had to figure out how to fix it so that she would be burned at the stake. So one morning she wakes up and her dress, her women's clothing is gone. It's no longer in the jail cell. There's only the men's clothing that she promised not to wear again. And she has to go to the bathroom. But she has to put clothes on. And her guards won't let her do anything but put on the men's clothing. So if she puts on the men's clothing, so she can walk around, because there's no other clothing to wear, she will have gone against what she agreed to do. She will have broken the biblical clothing law, which is the only technical way that they condemned her. Okay? She had promised not to wear men's clothing anymore, but here she's going to wear them again. So they forced her into that situation. She had to put on the clothes that were there, and when she put them on, that made her what Cochon called a relapsed heretic, who had gone back on their promise to live according to the way the church wanted her to live in what they considered the right Christian manner. So she was relapsed heretic, and that guaranteed a death sentence. So they forced her into that situation. And when that happened, and here we have the moment it happened, and here we have the very writing, Cochon comes into her room. Let me pull this up, because I want to read to you what she says in this final moment that decided what was going to happen to her. Because she says, through his saints, God informed me of his great sorrow for the treason that I had committed by signing the abjuration. Abjuration is when she recanted. To save my life, I betrayed him, and in so doing, I damned myself. So those are her words that they wrote down right here. And in the margin, you find these words, Resposio mortifera, fatal answer. In making that statement, that was the fatal answer that got her condemned to death. In other words, by saying, I was afraid and I told you that my voices weren't real, but that was a lie. So she goes back to say, I do believe in my voices. It did happen. And that is the fatal answer. So they managed, after a year's time, to do that. To burn her alive, which she was so terribly afraid of course. And all I want to say about that, there's no point going into gory details. The morning it happened, in May of 1431, they made her listen to an hour-long sermon before, while standing right there. And she did it calmly and with dignity. And she asked for a crucifix. And an English soldier, the enemy, felt so bad for her that he made one with his own hands right then and there and brought it up to her. Then she asked for a crucifix like that one there that she could look at when they lit the fire. And so they did that. And she said the name of Jesus very loud when the flames started rising. She said it 6 times. And finally, the loudest time at the very end, she cried out, Jesus. And there were 10,000 people gathered to watch this awful event. They had built the pyre very high so everybody could see this. That's the Middle Ages for you. And when they all heard, all 10,000 of them heard her cry out the name of Jesus, everybody started crying. Everybody felt horrible. One of the witnesses was the secretary to the King of England. And he said, we are doomed. We have just burned a holy woman. And the executioner said, my soul is damned because I have executed a saint. So everybody witnessed in her death that this was a beautiful soul. And even the worst of them, except maybe for Cochon, felt terrible guilt and wept like a baby over this awful injustice to this wonderful person. Then after she was dead, they burned the body twice more to turn it all into ashes. And it is said that her heart did not burn. In some mysterious supernatural way, her heart did not burn. And the English put the ashes in a bag and threw it into the Seine River so that nobody could have relics of Saint Joan of Arc, so that we today could not have something of hers to venerate. That's how evil they were. That's how they knew what a good person she was, and that she would be venerated eventually. And sure enough, 25 years later, at the request of her mother, they retried her. They went through the trial again and decided she was completely innocent, that she was tricked, that dirty things were done, that they changed her words in the transcript of the trial, that was all wrong. And so they claimed her to be innocent. 25 years later. And in 1920, she was made a saint of the Western Church. It took a while, didn't it? But centuries of people remembering her and loving her for her courage and her love of God and the persecution she'd been through, carried on down through France especially, was a great courage to soldiers of World War I, to all Catholics in the nation who recognized in her truly someone who saw the divine light and gave herself to it and lived by it. So we end on this tragic story and yet this beautiful story, because what we have is proof that angels do speak to us, that we are called to take action in the world, whoever we are, however small and weak we are, that God wants to do great things through us if we will only listen. And that's the story of Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. Thank you very much.